Welcome to yet another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome if you're joining in for the very first time. The purpose of this show and the episodes in this show is to help technical operators, whether you're a SQL Server DBA, systems administrator, or maybe you're a developer and you now have to take care of SQL Server. You've been voluntold, and you now fall under the category of accidental DBA. And you have to think about, you have to design, you have to manage, you have to troubleshoot and take care of SQL Server high availability solutions. This is for you. Although on the flip side, it's also for managers, people who are managing teams that are responsible for SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. The goal is to share insights, lessons learned, experiences, mistakes made from some of my customers, and my mistakes as well. I do not claim to know everything. In fact, the reality is a lot of these mistakes and a lot of these lessons come from both my mistakes and my customers' mistakes, and start to see a pattern. And the biggest mistake that I see, and one of the reasons I focus so much on the non-technical aspects of high availability and disaster recovery, is the fact that customers and technical professionals themselves focus so much on the technical implementation, the technical features of a high availability solution, or even SQL Server, or a Microsoft Data Platform solution, not realizing that simply is one piece of the entire puzzle. You have to look at everything from the ground up. And it is a little bit challenging because most of the time as technical professionals, we would rather zoom in on the technical implementation because that's easy. I mean, that's what you go to school for. That's what you learn from watching YouTube videos and taking online courses. But the things outside of the technical implementation and the features and technical capabilities of a product is what will help you stand out as a technical professional. When you're looking at the business, when you're looking at how to implement a feature to meet a business requirement, that is what will help you stand out. We are still in this series called Inherited Disasters series. I think that was like 3 weeks ago, where I started off with this Inherited Disaster series, where the premise of which is you are starting on the job, brand new, probably your first week, or you're a consultant coming into a new environment or a new customer environment, and all of a sudden you have to deal with a complete disaster, a complete mess. You know for a fact, looking at the different configuration settings, you're looking at the environment, it's a mess. What do you do with it? And I started out with teasing what I call the A.R.T framework. And then last week, I started diving into more detail on the letter A, which is the assessment piece. Quick recap on the assessment piece. You don't just go ahead and do the technical assessment, because again, that's the normal thing that we do as technical professionals. You assess for compliance, because that has a bigger impact to the business. You assess for security, and then you assess for high availability and disaster recovery capabilities. Part of the A.R.T framework is taking what you've learned from the assessment and using the letter R in the A.R.T framework as the second phase. And again, the temptation is to jump right in and make modifications to the environment, running queries, changing the configuration settings. Hold your horses, okay? Do not make changes yet. Unless, of course, it's an emergency change where you know for a fact if you don't fix this, like you come in, you saw that the disk is running out of space, and you know that the minute that disk space hits 0, the entire database server will halt. Now that is something that you need to immediately address. That's an emergency change. So R, I kind of look at it, it's not a one thing, but it's a couple of different things. R, I call this the 4 R's. Okay, 4 R's, and I like using either acronyms or groups of 3s or 4s because it's easy to remember. Okay, grab your pen and paper, start taking notes. I broke it down into, there's 4 R's, but I broke it down into 2 sections. The first one is to rate the risks. You take what you've gotten from the assessment. You look at the security assessment, you look for compliance assessment, you look at HADR assessment, and then you categorize them, you rate them according to criticality. When I was working as a consultant for a managed services provider, we have this framework for rating risk. We call it the low-hanging fruit. Low-hanging fruit meaning low impact, or rather low risk, high impact. That's one. Or high risk, high impact. Or high risk, low impact. You create your own category and you rate the risks. And it's easy, especially if you're in a regulated environment where you cannot just make changes. So you start off with categorizing the risks. Is this a low risk, high impact kind of change? And when I say impact to the business, an example of that is the disk space. Okay, you looked at the analysis, you looked at the HADR assessment that you've done, and it may simply look like a simple disk space issue. Sure, you looked at the data, the amount of time it takes to increase the size of your database for the entire disk volume. And you know for a fact that you could take it can take an additional 5 or 6 weeks, again, looking at the data, not just guessing. You looked at the auto growth increments for all of the databases, and then you plotted that in an Excel spreadsheet to look at potential day or date when the entire disk is full. Now you might be thinking, wait, why don't you just delete all the files in the drive? What if the only files in the drive are your databases? You can't just delete that. You can't just go ahead and shrink it. Not a good recommendation. So part of that is you are going to make a request, which of course I'm getting ahead of it. You're going to request for an increase in the disk's volume size from your storage administrator. Now, of course, there's a couple of things that could come with that request. We don't have enough, meaning the allocated disk space is used by other resources. Maybe your mail server is using that, so it cannot be allocated to your database disk volumes. So low risk because it will take a little bit of time. You have enough time for you to make some modifications without making impact. Low risk, high impact. High impact meaning if you don't get this thing done, your entire database server will go offline. Okay, that's an example. But you categorize the risk. Come up with a based on the assessment that you've gotten from the security, the compliance, and HADR assessment. Come up with an Excel spreadsheet where you will list down every finding, and then you categorize and rate them according to their risk, kind of like risk assessment. Okay, what is the impact to the business? What's the impact to the day-to-day operations? And again, not all systems are created equal. The challenge here is, of course, especially if you work in a very large organization, you start asking the business stakeholders. They will tell you, no, our databases are more important than those guys. The salespeople will say, no, our system is more important because it's helping the company generate revenue. And the marketing department would say the same thing. So it is a little bit of a challenge because you're trying to get facts based on what the function of the system is for. Okay, and again, it could be political. So start again. The first thing you have to do is rate the risks, okay, and categorize the risk according to criticality. This is a little bit more challenging than you got a phone call, the system's down, and you need to address it immediately. Because rating the risk, well, nothing's offline. There's no emergency. And so you would spend a lot of time trying to debate whether or not a risk is high or low depending on feedback or input from other business stakeholders. That's why this is important. And this is no different from you triaging emergencies. Like imagine you got an outage situation, a performance issue with your database, and all of a sudden your phone is ringing. You have to deal with all of these emergencies because you're the only person taking care of the database. You have to decide which one is more important, the performance problem or the outage problem. Okay? Now, you might be thinking, wait, I need to deal with an outage problem. But if that outage problem is in UAT or staging, well, I don't really care at this point. Although it is an outage problem, it's in UAT, it's not in production. Versus a performance problem that is hitting the production system. So categorizing and rating the risk is a little bit of a challenge if it's not an emergency. If it's an emergency, sure. And of course, the reality is the loudest always gets the attention. That's one of the reasons why the people who would always get the attention will always scream the loudest. But you have to use the data that you've gathered from the assessment to rate the risks. And then after rating the risk, I did say 4 R's, right? After rating the risk is where you start requesting for the reduction of those risks. Okay? There's a lot of human aspect when it comes to this portion because, again, when you're rating the risk, if it's a technical problem, sure, no big deal. Like, sure, again, I'll use that example that I mentioned earlier, disk space or outage situation versus a performance problem. Instinctively, as technology professionals, we would rather deal with the outage situation versus the performance problem. But if the outage situation is happening on a non-production system, it's a no-brainer. Versus performance issue happening on production system, we need to get that thing up and running. But in this case, again, where it's not an emergency, the feedback, the input, the information that you've gathered from the assessment will all have to factor into what is categorically a high risk, a low risk. And we're not just looking at risk from a risk point of view, but also the impact. Okay, I remember one security assessment that I've done. And you might be thinking, wait a second, I thought you were supposed to be doing high availability. Well, the reality is, if security becomes a problem, then your high availability systems become unavailable, like a compromise. Remember the issue from way back. I forgot the name of the product. I don't want to name products, but almost the entire world came to a halt. Even high availability systems came to a halt because of a security issue. So you have to categorize that. So going back, it could be a security risk, but you've identified it as something that only affects a small portion. And not only does it affect a small portion of your entire infrastructure, it is also isolated from your critical systems. So it could be categorically identified as high risk as far as security is concerned, but low impact at the moment. Again, using that example of an outage on a non-production versus performance issue on a production system. And then you request for reduction of these risks. You do not, and I say again, you do not make changes immediately until you request for reduction. There's 2 reasons why you want to request for a reduction of these risks. One is documentation. Okay, and again, it's very easy, and it's tempting for us technical professionals to just jump in and fix the problem immediately, knowing for a fact that it feels good. But if it's not documented, for one, how do you know that or how do other people know? How would they know that you actually helped, you actually did the change? Okay. Now, this is not something that you have to think of. Hey, I need to promote myself. I need to talk big about myself. No, this is simply documentation. And at the end of the year, when you're doing your performance reviews, when you're doing performance evaluations, you're meeting with your manager, you have something in writing, and you can claim this is something that I did. You do a before and after. And again, going back to the A part of the A.R.T framework, you did the assessment. These are all the information that I've gathered from the assessment. This is the request that I've submitted. And keep in mind, just because you made a request doesn't mean it's going to get approved. Okay? Requesting documents, submitting a change request, and you know for a fact that you're not just submitting a request for the sake of, I need to do something. No, you're submitting a request for change to reduce the risk. And of course, again, like I said, just because you submitted a change request doesn't mean it will get approved. So that's the first one. You are documenting. And because you have a before, you can have an after report. The before is your assessment. These are the data. If it's a compliance issue based on the assessment you've done, you can say, hey, these are the risks associated with this request. If the request got approved, you implement the change. That's what we're going to talk about in the next episode, by the way. Once the request is approved, you make the modification, and then you now have the after report. This is what it was before. This is what it is after. It is very difficult to quantify something if you don't have documentation, if you don't have numbers, like metrics to say, oh, this is high risk, this is low risk, this is what I did to address this risk, this is the before, this is the after. Okay? That first one is documentation. 2 is change management. Why are we submitting a request for reduction? Because part of this, because you've seen it, it's a risk. The next time you are going to be building a similar system, a similar infrastructure, or you're evaluating other systems as well. Say, for instance, you're only allowed to look at one small system. You started doing the assessment on that system. You can replicate that on other systems. This makes it a little bit more scalable, especially when the environment starts growing. Okay, you want to think about scalability not just from the point of view of your work, because now you've done this, and you know how it is when the environment starts growing. You start implementing scalability factors, like this is how we build our VMs, this is how we configure our SQL servers, this is how we configure our storage. It becomes a repeatable practice. So if you've, let's say, identified the risk based on the assessment, and I keep going back to the assessment part, because this is something that you have to bring into the request. Once you've implemented it, after approval, of course, once you've seen the benefits of it, you can now start replicating it. I should have added the 5th R to replicate, but we haven't done any change yet. So you request for the reduction. Also, more than just having proof that this is something that you did after a couple months during your performance review, this is also something that you can use as a defense fact. What do I mean by that? I did mention that just because you requested for change doesn't mean it will get approved. Again, politics, there are things that are happening, there are more priorities, there are things that you need more attention than what you're requesting for. Remember, keep in mind, this is a risk. You're exposed, or the system is exposed to a risk. If the risk gets exposed and something bad goes wrong, you have documentation in place that says, I've identified this before, I've requested for the reduction of this risk, I've submitted the request, it did not get approved. This is the side effect. And a lot of that is, again, the documentation in place. And there's so many cases of issues that I've dealt with in the past where somebody would say, hey, we have to test the backups. Just an example. We have to test the backups. We're fine. A couple months later, they had an issue, tried to restore the backups. It didn't work. It's very hard to say, I told you so. The natural tendency is for us to say, I told you so. But the I told you so without the fact is very difficult to quantify. But with a proper change request, with the proper documentation in place, if the risk ends up happening and you become a victim of that risk, you got exposed to that risk, you have documentation in place that says, this was a request that I made, it just did not get approved. Versus, oh, whose responsibility is this? Then it becomes your fault because you didn't take care of it. And this is, again, it is very challenging to not do stuff, okay? Because part of that is, again, even though you know for a fact that it is something that will help reduce the risk, it is also to your advantage if you don't immediately address the risk without proper approval. Because we want to make sure that upper management, whether that's your boss or whoever's responsible for that system, whether that's an entire infrastructure or just a database, whoever is aware and are making decisions on approving your request because it is addressing a risk. Okay, so those are the 4 R's, and again, it is very challenging, and I keep saying it's very challenging because it really is. We're dealing with people, we're dealing with risks associated with the technical implementation of your either high availability solution or your database solution or your entire infrastructure. I don't just look at it from a database point of view, I look at the entire infrastructure, because whether that's your database or that's your app or that's your API or that's your middle tier, the risk applies to everything. When you're doing the assessment, you're not just looking at the database. Of course, as a database administrator, you're looking at the database, but you start having conversations with the network team, the sysadmin team, the development team, the vendors, and do the assessment part of, the A of the A.R.T framework. And then looking at how they can do the same thing so that you start reducing the risk. And this is a never-ending process, by the way, because there are new systems being implemented, new risks are being introduced, and this is something that you have to constantly do. So those are the 4 R's. Rate the risk, categorize them as to low risk, high impact, or high impact, or high risk, low impact, and might be a simple change that does not require a maintenance window. You can do it on a normal business day. Or it's it's something that requires massive change to either the code base, the infrastructure, the database schema, the configuration that would require a maintenance window, so you have to push that outside of normal business hours, but you make sure that you have documentation in place to request for the reduction of those risks that you've rated. I'm trying to keep the 4 R's in that statement right there. Keeping the documentation is one thing. For your record, if you have a proper change management process in place, a ticketing system, you would submit a request change form. Somebody has to approve it, and it's there. It's documented, and you can keep track of it. And then come up with a schedule on how to implement those changes and follow up if they're not approved yet. Okay? It's easy to give up on something, especially if people are not really, your managers, stakeholders are not putting a lot of emphasis on it. Because you've done your part, your assessment, your reduction of risk and rating those risks for reducing those risks, and it's not getting approved for implementation. Okay, it is, but it's also part of what you need to do when you've inherited a system that is a complete mess. Because the goal is to keep it stable, reliable, highly available, fault tolerant, so that you can start doing more expensive, or not expensive, more impactful, not expensive. Why did I say expensive? More impactful work. Expensive because if you don't reduce the risk, it becomes expensive to address those risks in the long run. That is about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Again, we're still on the series on inheriting disasters or inherited disasters, where you have to take action on an environment, a system, whether that's a database system as a database administrator, or maybe you're a sysadmin and you see both the database and the entire infrastructure, and you need to address those risks based on the assessments that you've done. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at T. Can't remember if I already mentioned that. T is when you take what you've learned, what you've gathered from the assessment, you've rated the risks and you've requested for the reduction of those risks, what's the next step? And that's going to be what we are going to be covering in the next episode. If you have any challenges with your high availability and or disaster recovery solutions, or you are thinking about implementing a high availability or disaster recovery solution, but you're not sure which one is which one is more appropriate, which one would reduce your risk, there you go, which one would be appropriate for the business. And again, if you're talking to vendors, they would always say, oh, buy the latest and the greatest, the most expensive one. I kind of think of it the other way around. I kind of think of it, implement the minimum acceptable solution that would meet your business requirement. Okay? And I say minimum acceptable because, well, for one, if you're in an industry where compliance requires that you have a high availability or disaster recovery solution, or both, then you need something. But you also don't want to be spending too much on it, because the goal is to make sure that make the business profitable. That's the goal. And our job as technology professionals is to help support the business to achieve that goal. If you need any help with anything related to SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions, reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. This will lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. And during what I call the strategy session, we'll do two things. One, we will evaluate or assess. I've already hinted that on using the A.R.T framework. We will assess what your challenges are, what the problems are, or what goal you're trying to achieve. And part of that is coming up with a strategy on how to address those issues, resolve those problems, and eventually achieve those goals. In some cases, I've had customers reach out and say, hey, we have this high availability solution. Nobody knows in the team how to manage it. We want to bring you in to help empower the team, train the team, teach them how to deal with this so that we can properly support it moving forward. Okay? Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and happy to help in any way I can. All right? That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA Show. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll see you again in the next episode. Goodbye.